I'm Bruce Hoffman. I'm a professor at Georgetown University and the Senior Fellow for Counterterrorism and Homeland Security at the Council on Foreign Relations. And tonight I'll be speaking on these disunited states, the rise of domestic terrorism in the United States. And essentially I focus on how the United States, unfortunately, is becoming a politically not just divisive country, but a violent country. For instance, since 2017, there's been at least 9 significant either attempts or actual political assassinations, with nearly half that number in the past year alone.
Board of Directors. We got the season off to a great start last Monday with Ambassador Ivo Daalder speaking about the future role of the United States in world affairs. And tonight, our talk tonight, I think, promises to be equally thought-provoking and significant. As regular attendees of these events, you will know that the mission of seminars is to present nonpartisan talks on a range of important and current policy topics, both domestic and international. The seminar topics chosen for this summer represent an eclectic mix of subjects, all of them timely and relevant to the issues currently before the country. As had been the case for the past 22 seasons, we have a distinguished lineup of nationally prominent speakers, including our guest tonight, Dr. Bruce Hoffman, whom I will introduce shortly. Finally, and most importantly, on behalf of the Board of Directors of Seminars at Steamboat, I want to express our sincere thanks and appreciation to all of the sponsors and the co-sponsors and other donors who have helped make this unique discussion series possible. Your support enables us to bring these impactful presentations to the Steamboat community free of any admission charge. My wife, Susan Perlich, and I are pleased to serve as the sponsors of tonight's seminar. And I also want to recognize and thank the supporting sponsors, Carol and Russell Atha. Donations help keep seminars free, and they are most welcome. You can donate by going to the seminar's website, or you can now also use Venmo. QR codes for both methods are also printed on the back of your program. And with these important matters out of the way, I now have the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, Dr. Bruce Hoffman, who will be speaking about the rising threat of domestic terrorism and political violence in our country from both the right and the left. I have known Bruce Hoffman professionally for many years, and I have greatly admired and benefited from his work. He is one of the world's leading experts on the general problem of terrorism, and his research and writing has also focused on insurgencies and political violence. Dr. Hoffman holds dual appointments as a professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and also as a senior fellow for counterterrorism and homeland security at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. There's a detailed description of his professional biography on the seminar's website. The FBI defines domestic terrorism as, quote, violent criminal acts committed by individuals or groups to further ideological goals stemming from domestic influences, such as those of a political, religious, social, racial, or environmental nature, unquote. And as we all know, our country has seen a disturbing increase in the frequency of domestic political violence and terrorist incidents in the past few years, some of which have been perpetrated by lone wolf individuals and some by organized groups. Many of these illegal and often murderous acts have been committed by individuals or groups motivated by extreme political ideology, coming from both ends of the political spectrum, right and left, or in some cases by religious extremism or racial hatred. Unfortunately, as I said, there have been too many such incidents in recent years. And just to remind you of a few, we would note the January 6th attack on the US Capitol that included organized participation by members of self-proclaimed militia groups, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. the May 22nd racially motivated attack in Buffalo, New York, the October 22nd lone wolf attack on Paul Pelosi, the husband of then Speaker Nancy Pelosi, the arson attack on Republican Party headquarters in New Mexico in March of 2025, and the May 2025 bombing of Planned Parenthood Clinic in Palm Springs, California. And most recently, of course, we saw the shocking murder and attempted murder of two senior elected state officials and their spouses in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And finally, to this list of infamy, we must certainly add the two assassination attempts made against then-candidate Donald J. Trump during the presidential campaign of 2024. As I noted, Bruce Hoffman has written widely and frequently on the subject of political violence and terrorism. His most recent book in 2024, written with co-author Jacob Ware, is Gods, Guns, and Sedition, Far-Right Terrorism in America, which will be available for purchase and signing at a table at the entrance to the pavilion at the conclusion of tonight's event. Professor Hoffman's academic career has been distinguished by wide-ranging contributions to the study of terrorism, with a particular focus on the strategic, operational, ideological aspects of violent extremist movements. His influential book, Inside Terrorism, is widely regarded as the foundational text in the field, and it takes a deep dive into the history and the evolution of terrorism and the specific motivations of those who commit acts of terrorism and political violence. For the past 26 years, Bruce Hoffman has also served as editor-in-chief of the scholarly journal Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, which is the Google Scholar ranked as the most widely cited and consulted journal in the field. He has advised governments and military institutions around the world on how to combat terrorism and radicalization. And with that, please join me in giving a warm steamboat welcome to Dr. Bruce Hoffman.
Thanks, Mitch. Thank you. Thank you, Mitch, for that extremely kind introduction. Thank you all for inviting me to speak in Steamboat Springs. This is actually my first visit here, and I think as vacations ago, this has been absolutely the most outstanding one. I've just loved being here, so thank you for the opportunity to come visit. So, what I want to do in the first part of this presentation is take the pulse of political violence in the United States and do so through two lenses. The political one, obviously, but also in the second part of the presentation, I want to focus on the rising number of threats and attacks that are affecting all denominations and all faiths in this country. As we know, terrorism doesn't occur in a vacuum. It reflects the divisiveness, the polarization of society. It reflects the cultural divisions as well. And it manifests itself, of course, in violence, and violence that is most often, but not exclusively, targeted against individuals. And that's why I chose to also add a focus on the rising number of attacks of all houses of worship, which to me is a very disturbing phenomena and a reflection of the divisiveness that we see in our society today, and why I titled this lecture, These Disunited States. Then in the final third, I'll try to explain why this is happening. And, you know, I'm not... If you had invited me a couple of years ago, I might have said, I have some policy recommendations, I have some solutions. I'll very briefly talk about them, but I have to be honest with you, I've kind of lost faith in them as well. And I think it's going to take a much more significant change to get this country back on track and to get it united. So let's look at the political lens first. And just as Mitch in his introduction described, it's impossible not to look at what's going on in politics in terms of the violent threats to our elected officials without focusing on the rise of assassination in the United States. And here, a good place to start is 2017. And in fact, this would be a completely different presentation if tragedy had not been averted at an early morning baseball practice in Alexandria, Virginia, where the Republican congressional delegation was practicing for the annual charity congressional baseball game held at a national stadium. And on that day, a lone individual, unaffiliated with any organization, or at least that we know of, not following anyone's orders, took it upon himself to show up at that field armed and to attempt to murder the Republican members of Congress. This person, insofar as we know their politics, he was a self-identified supporter of Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont. That's about the extent as we know of his politics or even radicalization. But tragedy was averted that day. And the only reason tragedy was averted that day is that one of the congressmen practicing was Representative Steve Scalise from Louisiana, who was at the time, and still is, the majority whip in the United States House of Representatives. And because he was the majority of whip, he had 2 plainclothes U.S. Capitol Police officers with him. So when the assailant opened fire and managed in rapid order to seriously injure 5 people, and actually Steve Scalise almost died, there would have been a greater tragedy had not the 2 plainclothes U.S. Capitol Police officers opened fire and killed the assailant. So here was an incident that, if a number of congressmen, even one, had been murdered, would have been very different atmosphere in the United States thereafter. We then see a succession of incidents that involved targeting of both Democrats and Republicans. There was someone in Florida, for example, who manufactured 16 pipe bombs that he was putting in the mail to kill Democratic members of Congress. Following year, there was someone, there's some things in the study of terrorism you just can't make up, that even a thriller writer couldn't invent them and be believed. But here was an individual named Christopher Hassan, worked for the United States Coast Guard, used his official government computer to amass targeting details of senior members of the United States Congress, who happen to be Democrats, leading figures on MSNBC, on CNN, and so on, and stockpiled a small arsenal of roughly 50 weapons or so. And he was detected because he was stupid. He was using his government computer. Again, you couldn't invent these things. Tragically, in 2020, a man, you hear this term now more often than ever, misogynist, someone who traveled in the environment of the manosphere, was very mad at a state judge in New Jersey. On a Sunday evening, showed up at her door, dressed or pretending to be a Federal Express employee to deliver a package. Did not, fortunately, harm or kill the judge, but did murder her son and seriously wounded her husband. Then, of course, just before the 2020 general election, there was the plot in October 2020 to kidnap and execute Governor Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan by a far-right militia calling themselves the Michigan Wolverines. Only a few months later, we have one of the most enduring visuals from January 6th. In fact, it's on the cover of my book. It was a scaffold and a hangman's noose that had been erected in front of the United States Capitol on the day that Congress was going to certify the results of the Electoral College. Now, that noose was not, as many people assumed, meant, for instance, the Speaker of the House at the time, the Democrat Nancy Pelosi. That noose was meant for a sitting vice president who happened to be an evangelical Christian and, of course, a Republican. And then the following summer, a left person on the extreme left, showed up outside the house of Associate Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh with the intention of murdering him, and just at the last minute, fortunately, got cold feet. 2022, you'll recall the incident in San Francisco, where a conspiracy theorist from Canada broke into then Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi's home in San Francisco and very brutally assaulted her husband. And then, astonishingly, in 2024, there were 2 attempted assassinations of President Trump as he was campaigning for re-election. You have to go back to 1968 and the assassination attempt on George Wallace for the last time that someone campaigning for president was targeted by an assassin who got remarkably close. So those are basically 9 incidents since 2017 that I see as the most significant ones. 2025 has been even worse. There have been nearly half as number of political assassinations or attempted assassinations. You had the firebombing on the first night of Passover very important Jewish religious holiday of the governor of Pennsylvania, who happens to be Jewish, Joshua Shapiro. Even worse, just as Mitch has described, just some weeks ago, we had the terrible assassination of the former Speaker of the House of Minnesota and the death of her husband by someone posing as a police officer. Remember, someone posed as a FedEx officer. And then the serious wounding of a state senator and his wife. Since then, we've had a plot to kidnap the Democratic mayor of Memphis, Paul Young. And then an incident just a few weeks ago, Representative Max Miller of Ohio was nearly run off, well, actually, in fact, he was run off the road by someone waving a Palestine flag and nearly suffered serious injury from that. So clearly, political assassination, unfortunately, is on the rise. When I was growing up in the 1960s, this was something, tragically and unfortunately, that was not an infrequent occurrence. Of course, the assassination of JFK in 1963, the assassinations of Martin Luther King and JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, in 1968. But it seems we've revived, unfortunately, that pattern that has remained dormant. And of course, as I described, members of Congress are also very much in the crosshairs of this process. So literally, you could say, ripped from the headlines. It doesn't matter. On almost any day, you can find an article of a new threat or even an attack directed against a member of Congress. This one is just from Thursday, in fact, or last Thursday, July 17th. And it was a former employee of the Voice of America who threatened a Republican Congresswoman from Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene. And this was part of what I regard amongst these many disturbing patterns as amongst the most disturbing, is that since 2017, the number of attacks or threats directed against members of the United States Congress has more than doubled. Looking at the numbers, we can see 4,000 or so in 2017 was not an enviable number, but the fact that it got close to 10,000 last year, and according to testimony that the U.S. Capitol Police recently gave on the Hill, 2025, sadly, is on course to be a record year. So this, I think, is fundamentally troubling. It's also, as Melissa Horton and John Hoffman's case in Minnesota illustrate, the threat is not just to national members of Congress, but to state representatives, and this has bridged the divide initiative from Princeton. Their numbers would show an upward trajectory of local appointed and elected officials being targeted. And it's not just our elected officials or appointed officials that are being targeted. It's other people as well. We saw last December, President and Chief Executive Officer of United Health was gunned down in a deliberate assassination attempt on the streets of New York City. Lots of people have lots of strong feelings, not inappropriately, about the private healthcare industry in the United States and about being reimbursed for our medical expenses. But what was astonishing was that in the aftermath of the death of an individual, a husband, father, someone gunned down from behind, the outpouring of support that we saw across social media, and I'll get to this a little later, and also on late night television and amongst the bands and clubs. But you can see some of these quotes that basically, and I'll come back to this too, justified and legitimized terrorism, used the murder of Brian Thompson as an argument that there should be a revolt in the United States. Not surprisingly, the environment we live in, that I'll also talk about in a few minutes, used it as a springboard for anti-Semitism. And what happened in that era is that his assailant, rather than being vilified or condemned, was actually lionized in many quarters. And the fact you could see, these types of photographs of him as a stud muffin became commonplace across social media and on various television stations. And that's the problem, is that once there's a wedge, once there's a perception of legitimization or justification of violence, it spreads outwardly. Within weeks, literally, other CEOs and presidents of healthcare companies, apart from United Health, but also of real estate companies, of other major industries in the United States were also, in the vernacular of our time, being doxxed. In other words, their personal details, their home addresses, their vacation addresses were being publicized, the prices that they paid for their houses and their vacation houses. And obviously, this was all part of waving a red flag at those who say it's not murder. He's a member of the ruling class, or she might be a member of the ruling class and deserves to die. And again, as I said, these threats migrate not just upwards, but downwards. If you can't target and you can't attack a well-paid CEO or a senior corporate official who has the resources to have personal protection, to have security at his home, what we saw, and that's in this bottom graphic, was all sorts of other employees of these companies, senior employees, other employees just being identified, similarly doxxed, and similarly being held up for attack. Last February and March, I don't know how many times I fielded calls from the media where the attacks on Tesla dealerships and even the individual vehicles owned by persons, acts of terrorism. There was a wide swath of people who were very angry at Elon Musk, disagreed with Doge, and thought that this was a perfectly reasonable and acceptable way to express their opprobrium for Elon Musk. And I was asked constantly, is it terrorism? And just before we came on, I was telling Mitch that I remembered very distinctly. One thing Mitch didn't say in his introduction is I've literally been studying, next year, I will literally have been studying terrorism for 50 years. I went to graduate school in 1976 before anybody was interested in terrorism. I started studying it. And fortunately, I have a very good memory. And I remembered that in 1998, on the cover of the annual FBI report on domestic terrorist incidents. This is one of the problems we have in the United States right now. The FBI, not since 2005, has issued annual reports on terrorism. So without that imprimatur, and remember Mitch used the FBI's definition, which is kind of the gold standard of what domestic terrorism is, we don't have a clear sense of what terrorism is today because we don't have the federal government, in that sense, informing us as they once did through analysis. But I remember very clearly when they did publish these annual assessments, and some of you as people who live in Colorado may remember this as well. The cover of the 1998 edition of Domestic Terrorist Incidents in the United States featured a photograph of a ski lodge being burnt to the ground in Vail, Colorado, that cost $53 million in damages. It was done by a radical left-wing environmental group calling themselves The Family. There was no debate that that was terrorism. Vandalism, arson can be terrorism. To me, it was clear this was, but there are many people who, of course, found excuses about it. It's not just CEOs, it's not just products, members of boards of trustees, and not just of corporations, of universities. This was a demonstration. That headline is from Barry Weiss's The Free Press. There was an exhibition at Columbia University at the beginning of January, as you can see from the top infographic, that extolled the virtues of the October 7th, 2023 attacks. That's not my point now. My point is here. It had photographs of all the boards of trustees with their bios and also personal details and information, to mobilize and summon protesters and demonstrators to express their opprobrium for Columbia's policies by harassing them in their homes. In fact, I know a senior official in the New York City Police Department who also intervenes in the events that happened at Columbia in the spring of 2024, who found demonstrators also in front of their home as well. So this idea of doxing people and then going after them at their homes, harassing their family and their friends is becoming more commonplace. And then as we've seen in recent years, it's not just elected or public speakers or captains of industries or titans of technology that are being targeted. 2004 survey of journalists found that more than a third of journalists in the United States reported having been threatened with violence or having experienced violence themselves. And fully a third experienced threats communicated through them through digital media. In other words, through emails or on social media. We all remember 3 years ago, similar gathering like this, the Chautauqua Festival in upstate New York. The author Salman Rushdie, author of the Satanic Verses, who had a fatwa put on his head in 1992, was stabbed multiple times and nearly died by a Lebanese American from New Jersey. 2004, in that middle photograph, as I said, this doxing phenomenon, targeting people in their homes. the director of the Brooklyn Museum, and two of the members of the board, two of the trustees, who all happen to be Jewish, were targeted for being Zionists. And you can see that the condominium apartment building where the director lived was desecrated with, not just with graffiti in red and various obscene messages, but with the inverted red triangle, which is widely known as the Hamas targeting symbol to drive home the intimidation. And then just a few months ago in May, there was a terrible death of a young couple outside of the Jewish Museum in Washington, D.C. And you can see I'm deliberately not using the phrase two Israeli embassy staffers, which I actually think is insulting, because they weren't killed because they worked at the Israeli embassy. The assailant had no idea where they worked. Rather, he stalked this young couple who were about to be engaged to be married, followed them to the corner, and pumped 21 bullets into them. In fact, executed Sarah Milgram as she crawled away. One bullet will kill someone, especially when you're firing at close range at someone's back. But to fire 21 bullets, that's part of the problem. It's not only is there a rise of violence, but the violence is itself even becoming more obscene. And of course, in Colorado, we saw that just a few weeks later with the terrible attack in Boulder of a group of individuals who were marching to remember the hostages that are still being held in Gaza. Again, I've studied terrorism a long time. I can't recall a terrorist incident where someone used a homemade flamethrower to attack individuals. So violence is clearly on the rise in the political sphere. What to me is also so disturbing is that it reflects the divisions and the fissures in our culture. And that's particularly illustrated through what we see as a rising amount of violence that are directed against places of worship and clerics and worshipers as well. So again, in the rip from the headlines category, this is something that happened, I put last weekend, but it's actually 2 weekends ago. Now, there was a shooting at a Kentucky church. I mean, this happened to have been, at least that we know now, completely apolitical. But if we look at some of the incidents going back to 2012, we see that many of the attacks were mass shootings and involved hate crimes. The attack on a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. Various attacks against Jewish community center and an old age home. One of the worst attacks, of course, in 2015 at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, where the worshipers welcomed their assailant into the church, welcomed him to pray with them, and that became the opportunity that he seized upon to murder them. An incident that actually wasn't terrorist-related or a hate crime, but I put it there because over 24 persons were killed. So these kinds of shootings can claim large numbers of fatalities. And a particularly interesting incident was the one where fortuitously only one person was killed, but still tragically, an elderly worshiper. 3 were wounded at a Jewish synagogue in Southern California. The initial target of the assailant then had been a nearby mosque. In fact, he set fire to the mosque, but it didn't burn down. But then he decided to make sure his next attack succeeded, he used a firearm. You can see several other attacks against Jewish targets, including one of the most serious ones on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018. But also a series of arson attacks on mosques, underscoring that that attack in Escondido in 2018 was not an aberration. And that's the problem, is what we see is religious intolerance in the United States. Hate is on the rise as well. You'll all be familiar with the most recent report, or perhaps all be familiar with the most recent report to the Anti-Defamation League, which reported that in 2024 it was the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents recorded since 1979. Over a 300% increase for the past 5 years, astonishingly nearly a 900% increase over the past decade. Even more concerning was a poll that was just released by the ADL 2 weeks ago. 1 in 4 Americans now think that it's okay to attack Jewish people. I mean, that's astonishing, right? When you dig down deeper, a quarter of Americans, or at least a quarter of the people that were surveyed, said not only is it okay, but it's perfectly understandable. And in fact, another quarter believed that they were false flag operations, that they weren't even carried out by genuine assailants of Jews, but were implemented by the Jews themselves as a kind of blame the victim to garner sympathy. Even people who subscribe to, who accept not just Palestinian rights, but let's say use terms that have become very controversial, such as globalize the Intifada, from the river to the sea. Over 2/3 of them accept and realize perfectly well that those types of slogans can materialize and can be used to justify and legitimize attacks on Jewish people. But the sad news is it's not just Jews. And this is, of course, one of the arguments of the Anti-Defamation League, is that religious prejudice and hatred knows no ethnic or religious boundaries. 2024, also according to the Council on Islamic American Relations, was unfortunately a banner year as well in the largest number of hate crimes directed against Muslims and Arabs in America, 7.4% increase over 2023, with 40 incidents specifically targeting places of worship. Now, lots of times in discussions, anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are linked together. They're often discussed as being two of the ills that are undermining our society. In researching this talk, what absolutely astonished me, but maybe it won't to any of you, is that attacks on churches have also been increasing precipitously. In fact, one reliable survey reports an 800% increase in the number of attacks in churches across the United States between 2018 and 2024. That's 430 incidents on average each year, about 39 a month. And once again, 2024 becomes a banner year with more than twice the number of attacks reported on churches compared to 2022. And interestingly as well, Catholic churches in particular have been specifically targeted. There's been more than 500 attacks since 2020 on Catholic churches and some 24 thus far this year. In fact, probably for my money at least, the best pamphlet or the best guide to securing a house of worship has been produced by our brothers and sisters in the Hindu community, that they have an excellent guide hearkening back to the attack on the Sikh temple back in 2012, that they realized that this kind of violence is permeating all faiths. They've put together a really impressive document on how to secure houses of worship, very practical recommendations on how to secure houses of worship. So let me get to the final part of the presentation. Why is this all occurring? And let me use an example of two cinematic examples, two examples from very popular films. So think back to a decade ago, and the hit film of the summer of 1995 was Independence Day. And remember, sort of the climax of Independence Day is when aliens from outer space destroy the White House. And we could all laugh at that and imagine its improbability and enjoy the movie. It's kind of disturbing, at least to me, that last year, maybe not a hit film or a blockbuster, but a very revealing film about our society and our culture was the film Civil War, which actually also depicts an all-out assault on the White House, which suddenly in the 2020s was not nearly as fantastical as what we had seen in 1995. So why is that? Well, firstly, and I alluded to this earlier, something that troubles me greatly is that terrorism is becoming increasingly accepted, legitimized, rationalized, excused. We see this especially in the context of events in the Middle East, where terrorism is being justified as a tool that the oppressed or the oppressed class or the Southern Hemisphere can use to finally attain justice or exact retribution against the Northern Hemisphere. And you can see in some of those subheadings quotes from Ivy League universities, private colleges, liberal arts colleges, State University in my own state, Virginia Commonwealth University, where you have any number of academicians actually lending an intellectual imprimatur, a stamp of approval on precisely these types of sentiments, where you have, in fact, a Columbia student who actually, in a disciplinary hearing, is telling the deans that they're lucky that he's not going out and killing Zionists, and somehow is only disciplined after there's a public outcry, and then even the discipline is watered down. But I think what concerns me the most is that it's become now commonplace at many demonstrations that are expressing legitimate First Amendment rights, that are realizing the right to self-determination and statehood of the Palestinian people. That's not what I am criticizing and condemning. But when you start waving terrorist flags of terrorist organizations, including organizations that have killed Americans, when you're wearing head banners, and when, in 50 years of studying terrorism, I have to say, I thought I would never see something like this. On February 23rd in Washington Square Park in New York City was a rally attended by a few hundred people, but still it wasn't an insignificant rally, that celebrated the martyrdom of Saeed Hassan Nasrallah. Hassan Nasrallah is the former Secretary General of Hezbollah who was killed by the Israelis last September. With the exception of Osama bin Laden, there is no terrorist leader in the world who had more American blood on his hands than Hassan Nasrallah. And to have a celebration of Nasrallah in New York City, not very far from Ground Zero, from the site of the 9/11 attacks, is showing where people's mindsets are in excusing, justifying, legitimizing terrorism. Well, that's the Middle East, and that may be more understandable because the Middle East has always been a cauldron of conflict, seems irreconcilable. But I want to go back to my point about Luigi Mangione, the murderer of Brian Thompson. As I said, that despicable terrible act became the fodder for late-night jokes on TV, became the thing of social memes all over social media, and became the kind of thing that leading singers were having their songs adopted and put on TikTok to glorify, to praise this murderer. Bands and singers turned them into folk heroes. I already talked about the arson attacks on Tesla dealerships. And then even when 1,000 protesters assaulting federal officers at a federal facility in Los Angeles, whatever you may feel about the politics involved in it, it is a crime to assault law enforcement officers and especially federal officers. But in many corners, that act and other acts have similarly been justified, rationalized, and explained. So the why is all this happening, I think, is illustrated by a series of polls that have been conducted over the past 4 or 5 years that show that members who identify themselves as voting for one or the other major party in the United States increasingly state that in certain circumstances, and we're not talking about far-fetched circumstances that exist in the United States today, violence against the federal government could be justified. The first example of this was, not surprisingly, in 2021, which was an extraordinarily eventful and emotional year. You had 36% of persons who identified them as Republicans and about 28% of people who identified themselves as Democrats responded to a University of Maryland Washington Post poll saying that violence would be justified. That was the highest response in 2 decades of that question being answered. And in 2016, not so long ago, not even a decade ago, those numbers for each party were only about 8%. So they're clearly multiplying. I won't read everything. They've stayed relatively constant, with an April 2024 survey finding that 28% of Republicans, slight decline, larger decline of Americans, still agreed with that statement. In the United States, is a democracy. We don't use violence to affect policy. We use elections to do so, but yet this is becoming increasingly prevalent in responses of individuals because of their frustration with the political system in the US. It's more interesting when you ask gun owners this question. And let me just point out, especially because I'm in Colorado, but I would say this anywhere, this is not an editorial statement on the Second Amendment by any stretch of the imagination. It is just a statement of fact. I mean, think about it. In 2020, 17 million firearms were sold in the United States. That's a large number. In fact, in the United States, there's one firearm for every 123 people. That's the most in the world. It's more than the next 25 countries combined. In fact, if this was one of my classes, I would say, does anybody want to guess what the number 2 country is? There's too many people here.
It's actually Yemen. And I think all of us would agree, especially with the Houthis, Yemen is a pretty violent place, right? It has been for a long time. There's one firearm for 57 people there. So there's a big difference. But this is an interesting poll, because one of the reasons that enables people who want to act on their violent impulses is access to firearms. So just last year, a poll of firearms owners, they were asked, do you agree that political violence can be justified in certain circumstances? 42% of owners of what the media calls as assault rifles, but knockoffs of the M16 and the M4, agreed. Slightly more than half of recent firearms purchases also agreed with that statement. And a little bit more of respondents who either have concealed weapons permits or regularly carry their firearms also agreed with that statement. So violence is within our grasp. And what we see is the extremes of the left and the right have almost come full circle, have almost joined in a horseshoe. For them, particularly on the left, it's the prevalence of anti-American, anti-Western statements. Statements that are now very typical at many universities throughout the United States, but have also seeped their way into the mainstream of politics. Westerners fighting for the total eradication of Western civilization. Fighting against tyranny and domination. And we saw a lot of this heated up when President Biden was in office. Again, some of the things that I could never have imagined. Outside of the White House, just about a year ago, there was a protest, and someone was holding the bloodied head of a mask of President Biden, but making the same point that was made with the scaffold outside the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, is that we should hold our political leaders accountable and even murder them. Obviously, that vilification will likely only intensify in the remaining years of the Trump administration. And part of the goal of these extremists is to provoke a response. They're baiting the situation. And the deployment, this is again not an editorial statement, but the deployment of the National Guard and the United States Marines to Los Angeles is exactly what they want to see. And they want to build confrontation. Confrontation that goes from civil protests to civil disobedience to what they call resistance, and even to terrorism. And I'm often reminded of the terrible historical example of Uruguay in the 1970s. There are many Latin American countries in the United States, in Latin America rather, that labored under military dictatorships, regimes of torture. But Uruguay was a beacon. It was a thriving democracy. It was described as the Switzerland of Latin America. It had a robust, free economy, liberal economic policies, and precisely the same goal was embraced by a terrorist group calling itself the Tupamaros, to create and deepen polarization and division, and to provoke the authorities to react. Well, the police could not contain the disturbances, so the army was called out. And the army imposed a terrible dictatorship over Uruguay and then broke the back of the Tupamaros in the worst way possible. So I'm going to come back to this in a second. This is what's known as the strategy of accelerationism. That's embraced by both the right and the left as well as the right. On the right, very much the same sort of policy. I would say it's dormant right now. It's played out mostly against individuals, elected political officials, and others. But part of the problems is that, again, not an editorial statement about the commutations and the pardons of sentences of people convicted on January 6th. But the point is, if there's no deterrence, and if people who commit acts of violence, even the assaulting of both federal and local law enforcement officers, are pardoned or excused, that doesn't exactly diminish any inclination when these people believe the situation dictates it to once again use violence. And in fact, individuals have said repeatedly that they are going to exact retribution or revenge for their own imprisonment. What we see is many people have lost faith in a system that they see that is totally corrupt and rotted, and believe the only solution is to overthrow the government, is to pull down the system and rebuild it anew. And the difficulty that at least I see as a terrorism analyst is before January 6th, we knew who many of these people were. And there was plenty of evidence in the weeks leading up to January 6th, plenty of statements from the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, that they were converging on Washington, that they were coming to Washington armed, that they weren't going to let the election be stolen from President Trump. But these organizations are diminished now. They're almost non-existent. They've basically been broken. And what we have is a phenomena where it's not organizations, but individuals or small collections of individuals that have burrowed or are burrowing deeper underground, who are far more difficult to track and anticipate, and therefore may pose a significant threat. And their desire, just like their left-wing counterparts, is to create chaos, to provoke government repression. But in their case, it's also to provoke increasing violence from the left, to lock the United States into a spiral of violence where everyone will conclude that we need a different system and that the current government isn't functioning. So we have this clash of competing realities that's characterized by a polarized political system. And of course, that is without any doubt, that is amplified, if not weaponized, by social media. So let me wrap up and conclude. So what's the bottom line? Bottom line is, unfortunately, in America today, both extremes, and I'm talking about the extreme wings of the ideological political spectrum, see advantage in setting America ablaze. They see the system as fundamentally corrupt and rotted, as I just said, and that it's so sclerotic and so paralyzed it can't be reformed. It just has to be pulled down. And in this horseshoe, or this full circle that I described, we find both extremes embracing the strategy of accelerationism, which is to say, using small acts of violence to spark an upward cycle of chaos and disorder that eventually will spark a wider conflagration and will bring the system down and inspire copycat attacks. There's the danger as well of vigilante violence. The fact that Kyle Rittenhouse shot three people, two fatally, in Kenosha, Wisconsin, 5 years ago, was acquitted of all charges. And then a point that I made earlier, that 1 in 5 surveyed in America, at least last year, agree that Americans may have to resort to violence in order to get the country back on track. Now, 5 years ago, I started writing this book, which, as Mitch kindly said, is available for sale. It was published in January 2024. Even though the focus was on violent far-right extremism, which at the time seemed the more prevalent threat, I would say as this presentation, I hope, is communicated, we can't ignore or dismiss threats from either extreme of the political spectrum. Even though it focused on the far right, nonetheless, the largest chapter in that book was on policy recommendations and viewed holistically how we can counter the divisiveness and polarization that is pulling the United States apart, dividing families, but also, as we know quite clearly, has divided the polity. And Jacob Ware and I, my co-author, came up with 3 broad categories of reforms. The first were in the short term, which was strengthening the regulatory framework, in other words, new laws. And because this book was produced as part of the Council on Foreign Relations book series, Council on Foreign Relations has a lot of gravitas. We spent most of January 2024 meeting with members of Congress on both sides, although there's more Democrats than Republicans. I mean, generally speaking, it's always going to be members of the opposition party that are looking for new ideas, but we met with Republicans as well. You could imagine, given some of the conclusions in the book, there wasn't necessarily widespread agreement on all the recommendations. But the one thing we found that both Republicans and Democrats agreed upon was reform of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. This is the legislation from 1995 that indemnified social media from any liability for the content on their platforms, right? Traditional media, CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, Fox News, you name it. They all have responsibilities that they are responsible for the content. It has to be truthful, it can't do harm to people. So at a time when the United States, rightly so, was intent on growing the media, strengthening Silicon Valley and elsewhere, this legislation was enacted. As we know, and I remember this very clearly in the 1990s, that the internet was supposed to be an engine for education and enlightenment that was going to put us all on the same level playing field in knowing the truth. Well, We all know how well that has worked out. But it's fascinating. That was the only issue, really, but it's a very important issue that both sides agreed on. But Jacob and I were always surprised that so many members of Congress then looked at us, and we're both terrorism analysts. I'm an historian by training, Jacob's a political scientist by training. They said, well, how do we do it? And that worried me a lot. But at least there was some agreement, but we see there's been no movement on that. We then talked about the medium term, rebuilding civil society, encouraging digital and media literacy. In other words, teaching children in schools how to understand fact from opinion, how to recognize established experts and what being an expert means, and hopefully encouraging people to at least get on the same level playing field where they could communicate with one another and have reasoned debates. And we call that the rebuilding of civil society. And then in the long term, we hoped that within a generation, we would see America coming together again, that there would be this national unity reestablished. But I have to say, when I look at that chapter now, I realize it's not happening anytime soon. And that as pertinent as those recommendations may have been 18 months ago, I'm not sure how relevant they are today. And the reason I say that is because in a very recent survey, only a few weeks ago, 40% of Democrats supported the use of force to remove President Trump from office. 25% of Republicans supported the use of military against protesters, such as we saw in Los Angeles. Basically double the responses from last fall, just before the general election. So again, those patterns and surveys of opinion ossify or continue to ossify. Interestingly, an ADL, Anti-Defamation League survey from 2 years ago found a link between anti-Semitism and extremism on both the far left and the far right, which is my point about how the attacks on churches, mosques, synagogues, Hindu temples indicate an erosion of civil society in America. And perhaps controversially, I have to ask for the first time in my life whether we can actually turn to or look to our elected political leaders to save us, to get us out of this mess. I mean, many elected officials themselves are the ones who are on social media that are propagating these falsehoods, that are issuing sweeping accusations, that are casting aspersions, that are heating up the rhetoric and keeping it heated up to appeal and to cater to their extreme base. So, again, as a cinemaphile, I have to ask, go back, some of you may remember, as I do, that great 1976 film directed by Paddy Chayefsky called Network that starred William Holden and Faye Dunaway and the great Peter Finch. And remember, there's a scene where Peter Finch, very disheveled, shows up at the studio and Faye Dunaway, as the producer, says, no, let him on the air. And remember his famous line, he said, I'm sick and tired, right? And he stands there, he said, I want you to open your windows and say, I'm sick and tired. Is that where we have to go? But I actually do want to end on a positive note. And this is what keeps me working in this field when I probably should have retired some years ago. That keeps me optimistic, that makes me believe in America. And that was the evening of September 11th, 2001. After that terrible day, and if you haven't detected it already, I'm a New Yorker by birth. So of course, what happened at 9/11 seared into my memory. I was in fact across the street from the Pentagon when American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the southwest part of that building. So this was just an absolutely horrendous day. But that night, if you remember, both Democrat and Republican members of Congress gathered on the stairs of the U.S. Capitol, linked arms, and sang, God Bless America. And it was in that moment we realized the unity of this country, and we realized that united, we can do anything. And what I'm hoping, what I'm praying for, is we get back to that point. And I'm also hoping and praying that it doesn't take a terrible catastrophe like 9/11 to get us there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce. That was a very comprehensive and balanced presentation, so thank you very much for that. Let's give another round of applause to the speaker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have Many questions, lots of good questions from the audience. I have a few too. I'd like to tee up one that I'll start with. Given the range of the domestic sources of political violence and terrorism that you've described tonight, coming from both the left and the right, what do you see as the most immediate threat that the country faces? Would you say accelerationism is the most immediate threat, or are there others?
Well, it's accelerationism, certainly, and unfortunately, the 2020s remind me disconcertingly of the mid-1990s, and this was a time when there was divisiveness, not like there is today, but there was divisiveness, there was controversy. All sorts of things. We tend to think of conspiracy theories as a product of social media and of the 21st century. Remember, there were a range of conspiracies about President Clinton and about black helicopters in the United Nations. And this was into the cauldron that Timothy McVeigh stepped. He was just like the supporter of Bernie Sanders I described earlier. Timothy McVeigh did not belong to any terrorist organization. He was not carrying out anyone's orders, merely what I described of people going dark, conspiratorial cells. He got together 2 army buddies, one of them dropped out, but one stuck with him. And they perpetrated what until 9/11 had been the most lethal terrorist incident in the United States, the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Office Building in Oklahoma City. And what worries me the most is in this environment where terrorism is being legitimized, where right-thinking people who are nonviolent are holding or embracing more extreme views, is that whether it's the right or the left, are there the Timothy McVeighs out there? And especially in an era when you can easily acquire the wherewithal to make highly destructive weapons. But, you ask this question, what about foreign influence, for instance, foreign false flag operations that manipulate opinion in America? And this has already happened. We know there have been false groups. Just recently, in fact, there was a woman who claimed on social media that she was a Jewish woman, railing against a particular issue. It turned out to be a bot, a fake probably from Russia, but we don't know from where. So that's what worries me as well, is that in an era of artificial intelligence, deep fakes, that you don't just need a killer or someone like Timothy McVeigh. You can have dark forces manipulating others to embark down that path.
You mentioned Timothy McVeigh. It's a good segue to the issue of lone wolf violence and terrorism. We've seen many examples. You gave many examples tonight. What more can be done to identify and preemptively neutralize lone wolf actors? Are there things we ought to be doing to identify these people? It's got to be one of the most difficult police problems that exist.
It is. It's extraordinarily difficult because at least if you have an organization, you have communication between members, you have the dispensing of orders that can be interdicted or intercepted. You can infiltrate an organization. You can infiltrate the mind of an individual. You can judge from statements that an organization issues. A lot of groups telegraph their punch, tell us what they're going to do. You can't look within a man's soul and decide that. So I think, and that goes back to your first question, why I'm so worried is that it's a lone individual who unfortunately has a capacity for widespread violence. I think it's important, I try to look at if it's terrorism, it's terrorism, and that you don't look at the nature of the cause or the identity of the perpetrator or the justification or the rationale behind the violence, that we have to look at all terrorism as violence. And we have to also respect and empower federal agencies like the FBI that have done a remarkable job in keeping us safe. There has been no other 9/11. We haven't had the kinds of attacks in the United States that occurred, for instance, in Madrid in 2004, simultaneous bombings of commuter trains, or that occurred in London exactly 20 years ago, against simultaneous bombings of 3 subway cars and a bus. We've had terrible acts of terrorism, but not on those levels. So terrorism has to be non-denominational and apolitical. And also, as the great American patriot Thomas Jefferson famously said, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. We have to be vigilant. We have to understand that there is a domestic terrorist threat, that it's not fictional. that it spans a gamut of acts from desecration of Teslas to the murder of a former Speaker of the House. But also, too, we have to realize that we face a waterfront of adversaries. We have many foreign terrorist threats. Iran has on multiple occasions stated its intention, and it has been documented, that they want to kill President Trump, but they also want to kill former Secretary of State Pompeo. They want to kill National Security Advisor Rob O'Brien. I mean, various people that have talked about. So we have to also be vigilant about foreign threats as well.
Right. Not surprisingly, many questions focused on the lessons learned from the January 6th insurrection, and particularly a question about the pardons and whether this encourages the possibility of additional violent acts, given that all these people were pardoned.
Well, it was on the slide, so yes, I think so, because it denudes any kind of deterrent. But let me say specifically what I think is a problem, and I'm not alone in this, because the Vice President said the same thing, is that people that assault law enforcement officers and also federal law enforcement officers should be held accountable. If we excuse that, if we accept it, if we make all sorts of deals, then that, I think, undermines the ability of the people that are charged with protecting us from doing their jobs. So, no, absolutely.
Another aspect, of course, is the fact that we're seeing some very dramatic changes occurring in the allocation of resources at the federal level. It's not clear that that's affecting police functions, FBI and so forth, but are you concerned about that? Do you think that's going to be a near-term problem? Or do you think resources for surveillance, for intelligence gathering, as well as police functions is adequate?
No, they've been diminished. I mean, we saw this, within a week of the inauguration, 8 senior FBI officials whose only transgression is that the previous FBI director appointed, and these were dedicated civil servants, probably collectively between them had over 200 years of service, and they were dismissed. So I think we're depriving ourselves of the institutional memory, of the brain power, and that's extremely difficult. I mean, one of the things you didn't mention in your kind and generous introduction of me is I was a commissioner appointed by the United States Congress, by the Republican member of Congress, to a commission to investigate the FBI's transition from a law enforcement agency before 9/11 to one that was capable of intelligence. And I spent 15 months in the Hoover building. And like many people, I came in skeptical because the FBI is kind of a black box. I mean, many people don't understand the FBI. And also, let me back up for a second, too. I worked for 2 years. I was scholar in residence at the Central Intelligence Agency in counterterrorism. And what struck me comparing those two experiences, of course, the CIA is focused on overseas terrorism. I mean, basically, we would come up with all kinds of things, and we didn't have to go to lawyers. I was amazed in 15 months. Everything the FBI did was subjected to legal scrutiny review by both FBI lawyers and lawyers at the Department of Justice. Everything was closely monitored and closely watched and approved. So I have tremendous respect for the FBI and also for a lot of, I think, the dimensions of agencies like Department of Homeland Security, for example, National Counterterrorism Center, that were introduced under President Bush in the early and mid-2000s, that developed analytical capabilities that, as we demanded of our government, that could anticipate, could look over the horizon at terrorist threats. And unfortunately, in recent months, there's been a decision that those are all expendable and that we don't need them. And I think that will weaken us.
In your book, the issue of white supremacy is a major element. Can you talk to us about the connection between white supremacy and domestic terrorism?
Actually, a good way to do that is to explain how we came up with the title of the book, because that is exactly that purpose. As a young analyst, 42 years ago, one of my first assignments was domestic terrorism in the United States. It was largely because of Department of Energy contracts. They were very worried about threats from a range of adversaries. In fact, I got to visit Rocky Flats in the 1980s, which doesn't exist anymore, which was a fascinating experience as part of that research. And what I had noticed at the time, and what was concerning the Department of Energy, is that within the United States, there are various religious movements that were becoming militarized, that were using scripture to justify or legitimize violence. And they wanted to know more about them. And there were these white supremacist churches, Church of Christian Jesus Christ, for example, that believed that white Anglo-Saxon Protestants were the true chosen people, that Jews, people of color, were put on this earth as the spawn of Satan. And in essence, that was the God part of the book in the 1980s, is that this was a movement, white supremacism. It went from, let's say, the patriotism of the Ku Klux Klan to something that leaned very heavily on clerical authority and on scripture. And of course, one of the seminal crossroads in that movement was a conference that was held in Estes Park in 1988, and that mapped out the second part of the book, which was the guns part, which realized in 1988 there was a huge trial in Fort Smith, Arkansas, where 14 white supremacists were indicted on charges of seditious conspiracy, just like the 22 members of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, for example, who were convicted of those charges in connection with January 6th. Some of the hardest criminal charge, the most serious criminal charge in the United States, some of the hardest things to prove. One of the last people convicted of seditious conspiracy in the United States was the blind sheikh, Omar Hoffman, in 1995. So it's not easy to secure a conviction. This trial demonstrated that all 14 were acquitted. But in the aftermath of the acquittal, they realized their movement could have been completely decapitated, and it would have disappeared. And like all terrorist movements, they said, like the archetypal shark in the water that has to constantly move forward to survive, they needed to appeal to a broader and more diverse constituency. And they hit upon the idea of appealing to the militias that were just emerging across the United States. And of course, in the early 1990s, when the Clinton administration had passed what had to date had been the most far-reaching gun control legislation, there was widespread fears. This animated Timothy McVeigh, that the US government was going to take away people's weapons. And the movement made a conscious effort to go away from the theological basis and to use guns and to lean heavily on the militias. And then the sedition part is what we're seeing today, where there may be some religious elements, there may be some gun elements, but it's this lack of faith in the United States government and a conviction that the government has to be overthrown, that it can't function. So that's what we basically traced in the book, was this 40-year trajectory that went from something that was very religious to something that was appealed to a much wider group, gun owners, or militia members as well. And then that became very anti-US government. But the connecting tissue within that has always been racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia, so white supremacy.
We have seen significant evolution of the terrorist threat internationally, in terms of the means that they use, the nature of the groups that are conducting terrorist activities. Do you see similar parallels in the U.S.? Is the problem evolving in the U.S.?
I alluded to it in the presentation. It's not quite as developed in the United States, but I worry we're going down that path, is that terrorism was always bad enough. Because, look, in the terrorist mindset, it's almost like the media's mindset. If it bleeds, it leads, right? If there's no blood, no one's going to pay attention. And unfortunately, terrorism is about killing, and most often innocent people. What has really concerned me in recent years, going back to the rise of ISIS, the Islamic State, is that terrorists were always violent and heinous and terrible depredations. But we crossed the threshold about a decade ago. The mass enslavement of the Yazidi women, for example. The wholesale executions of Yazidis, Kurds, Shia, Chaldeans, and others. The assaults on the Christian church, for example, in the Middle East that we saw. I mean, just what was been described, I think accurately, as ultra-violence has become more normal. I would put what happened on October 7th, 2023 in the category of ultra-violence, the mass rapes, the mass killings, the kidnappings, the defilement of bodies. And that's what's worrying me in the United States, and I made this point in my presentation, is that someone lying prone on their stomach, one bullet's going to, or walking in front of you, one bullet's probably, maybe two is sufficient to kill them, and that's bad enough. but pumping nearly 24 bullets into individuals. I mean, this is just like what happened in Paris when ISIS attacked that heavy metal concert at the Bataclan in November 2015. The Paris Corner reported people being shot 10, 20, 30 times. I mean, this is a different kind of violence. And that's exactly what I thought about when I read that this individual, who fortunately could not get a firearm, but then was not dissuaded from his attack, invents a flamethrower that he uses against human beings. So what concerns me is that the international pattern where terrorism was always bad, but is now becoming like almost heinous violence, we're seeing some of those manifestations pop up in the United States.
Let me turn to a more personal question. And this is from one of the members of the audience. What led you to a career studying terrorism?
You know, it's an easy answer, and it plays into what we're talking about, is I thought to myself, so in any event, the reason I got interested in terrorism was a freshman in college. And back in 1972, the academic year started after Labor Day, not like now before Labor Day. So right after Labor Day in 1972 was when the attack on the Olympic Games in Munich happened. And while everyone was doing the things that freshmen do, I was glued to the TV, understood nothing about terrorism. It's a black and white TV with rabbit ears, but I was fascinated by terrorism. There's no opportunity to study it, but it was in the back of my mind. When I went to graduate school 4 years later, it just so happened that the mastermind of the Munich attack, Abu Daoud, was arrested in France, and despite long-standing extradition treaties with West Germany, where the Olympic incident occurred, and with Israel, whose 11 athletes were killed, France let him go. And I thought to myself, what is it about a phenomena that firstly can cause governments to override treaties they've engaged in, but secondly, results in governments lying to people and making all kinds of excuses? And that's what drew me to the studies. I thought, this is a phenomena that has more power than we're giving it credit for, if it can move governments in that way to risk diplomatic relations with countries, but also to lie to their own citizens and saying, I mean, they never provided a convincing reason why they released the mastermind of what's really one of the, the seminal terrorist incidents of the 20th century. That's how I became involved in it. And in graduate school, I did have the opportunity to study it, which I hadn't had in undergraduate.
Well, I think we have time for one more, and I'd like to ask you to think proactively about what unexpected or counterintuitive threats we might be facing in the near-term future here in the U.S., including the question I would add as sort of a footnote. We've seen evidence in Europe that the Russians have been acting to commit sabotage in many places in Western Europe as a way of counteracting the support for Ukraine. Do you anticipate that we'll be seeing those kinds of problems here too?
It's impossible to prudently dismiss them. This goes back to my earlier point that in this time we face just a waterfront of complex threats that are domestic as well as foreign. But if you had to sort of zero in on what's the thing I'm telling Congress, for example, that I worry about the most and that we are so ill prepared for, is the threat of drone attacks. We saw what happened very cleverly where in Ukraine smuggled bits and pieces and parts of drones into Russia and attacked vast distances, even in Siberia, a Russian airbase, and destroyed 24 aircraft. We saw how Israel did the same thing in Iran just a few weeks ago. Think about it in this context. We very recently have designated Mexican drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Again, I'm not opining whether that's a good or a bad thing. But Mexican drug cartels have a lot of money too, and they also bite when they're threatened. Think about it. Given the technological advances in drones, you could basically, from Sinaloa, Mexico, fly drones to San Diego, Los Angeles, that could drop ordnance. You could fly it into probably Brownsville, Texas as well. But it's not just drug cartels we would face. I mean, what the Ukrainians did in Russia, what Israel did in Iran, is something that terrorist groups could easily do. And we don't have good answers to these. Technologically, we do not have answers. Last year when we were doing a book tour, we were in Southern California and then in Southern Texas. And law enforcement officials in both places were telling us that drones are flying across the border all the time. I mean, in fact, a representative of Customs and Border Protection testified in December on the Hill that in one 3-month period, there were 9,000 drone incursions. And I asked in both California and Texas, well, how come you're not, I mean, shows my ignorance. I said, how come you're not shooting them down? They looked at me like, you innocent child. There's no legislation. They're not empowered to. It's only federal law enforcement in certain circumstances that can shoot down drones. And just pointing a shotgun in the air isn't going to necessarily take them down. So we are behind in a technology that, to me, is transforming warfare. And we've seen throughout history how weapons migrate from the battlefields into the terrorist arsenals. So that's probably the thing that worries me the most.
Well, on that bright and cheery note, please join me in thanking Dr. Bruce Hoffman.
Thank you.
We look forward to seeing everybody next week.